Zilano Prime's cities pulsed with soft light, towers carved from living crystal humming in resonant harmony. Their society had never built weapons. They engineered trees that produced light, buildings that grew rather than were constructed, and art that was encoded into genetic sequences. Their interstellar communications were built on trust, open channels, shared biocode, mutual pacts with 17 neighboring civilizations. They believed in a galactic community. Then the outer mining colony on the third moon went silent. Not just silent, gone. Scans showed no debris, no structural collapse, only a fine particulate dust where a settlement of 40,000 had been. 2 weeks later, an agricultural ring on the northern continent evaporated in the same way. No warning, no demands, just disappearance. Harvester units descended through the atmosphere not in ships but in swarms. They weren't mining. They were consuming. Molecular disassemblers broke down organic and inorganic matter alike, reducing forests, oceans, and cities to base elements for collection. They moved with methodical, impersonal efficiency. Nothing was spared. Nothing was valued. Captain Kira Ocean stood on the observation deck of the Planetary Defense Station, her hands flat on the console. She watched as the great emerald canopy, a forest that had glowed for millennia, went dark acre by acre. The light didn't flicker. It was erased. On her screens, biomass indicators dropped from thriving to 0 in minutes. She ordered the evacuation of the coastal cities, but she already knew. There was nowhere to go. The Zilani High Council composed a distress signal unlike any other. It wasn't just a message. It was a symphony of data. Prime numbers to signal intelligence, Fibonacci sequences to demonstrate sentience, emotional frequencies conveying fear, despair, and hope. They sent star charts, biological indexes, cultural archives. They transmitted on every frequency, directed at every civilization they had ever traded with, every ally they had ever known. 17 responses filtered back through the quantum relays. The Altarians expressed sympathy but cited resource allocation constraints. The Draknari Senate invoked non-interference protocols. The Centauri Republic suggested diplomatic envoys to be dispatched in 8 standard months. One by one, the replies echoed the same refusal. Not hostile, not malicious. Just absent Elder Vashkarel stood before the dwindling High Council, his crystalline form dimmed by exhaustion. He had personally communed with each galactic ambassador. His voice, usually resonant with bioluminescent warmth, was flat. They will not come. They see our end as inevitable. To them, we are already a lost cause. The planetary AI calculated total planetary consumption in 182 days. The harvesters didn't hurry. They didn't need to. Their progress was inexorable, their appetite infinite. Zilano's hope now hinged on a single, desperate gamble that someone somewhere would see their cry not as a problem to be managed, but as a people to be saved. The signal raced through the void, weakening with distance, filtered out by most receivers as anomalous noise. It passed through dead systems, skirted black holes, and drifted through the silent territories of empires that had long since turned inward. It was a whisper in the dark, a plea wrapped in math and dying light. Then it reached the outer detectors of a small, watery world on the galactic rim, a world whose species had only just begun to listen to the stars. Dr. Lisa Park's monitoring station at the SETI Institute in California registered a signal anomaly at 0347 Universal Time. The system automatically logged it as background cosmic interference, standard, protocol for filtering out pulsar bursts, solar flares, and deep space static. 99% of such signals were discarded without human review. But this one triggered a secondary algorithmic alert. Its structure was too ordered, too perfect. Park recalled the data stream for manual analysis. The signal pulsed with a base rhythm of prime numbers, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. Each transmission burst precisely timed. Interwoven were Fibonacci sequences, their growth patterns unmistakably non-random. Beneath the mathematical layers ran a subtler frequency, one the software initially classified as emotional bleed-through. It wasn't just numbers. It was fear, desperation, a profound, structured sorrow. She called over Jake Morrison, a signal processing specialist with a background in xenolinguistics. Together they ran deeper decryption protocols, isolating harmonic layers the initial filters had missed. Morrison identified embedded star charts first, coordinates that pointed to a star system previously thought uninhabited. Then came pictographs, simple, elegant images of crystalline structures under attack by geometric swarms, a countdown, tied to a local celestial cycle, 6 months. They cross-referenced the coordinates with existing astronomical surveys. The system was Zelano Prime, a world flagged for potential biosignatures but never deemed a priority for contact. The distress call wasn't just a greeting or a discovery. It was a countdown to extinction. The emotional carrier wave wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate part of the message, a plea meant to be felt, not just decoded. Park pulled communication logs from other major listening posts across the solar system. The same signal had been detected by facilities on Mars, Luna, and the Titan orbital array. All had logged it. All had filtered it out as noise. Standard procedure. For over a month, this cry for help had been treated as interstellar static, a curiosity for calibration, not a crisis. She accessed what little there was of humanity's shared galactic communication database, fragments of Altarian music, Draknari tectonic surveys, Centauri economic updates. Each of these civilizations had stronger receivers, better decryption, longer established listening posts. Each must have detected the Zelani signal. Their silence was not a failure of technology. It was a choice. The message contained schematics of the harvester swarms, their consumption rates, their apparent immunity to energy weapons. It detailed the precise atmospheric breakdown sequence, the loss of biodiversity, the silent erasure of a culture that communicated through light and genetic art. It was a complete tactical and cultural brief. A warning. A Requiem. Park drafted a summary for the Institute's director. She included the decrypted message, the star charts, the emotional resonance analysis, the 6-month window. She attached the logs showing 17 other civilizations had likely received the same data and done nothing. The document ended with a single recommendation. Elevate to Planetary Security Council. Immediate review. Humanity now held something no other species had bothered to claim, a full understanding of a dying world's cry for help. The data was clear. The implications were grim. The real question was not whether they could decipher the message, but what they would do with it. Treat it as information to be filed, or as a duty to be answered. The choice now moved from the quiet halls of research to the loud rooms of power. Scientists had done their part. They had pulled a scream from the silence. Now it was up to soldiers, politicians, and the people of Earth to decide if they would answer. The Altarian Empire's diplomatic corps sent their official response within hours of the Zelani plea's receipt. They offered advanced medical technology, atmospheric stabilizers, and refugee processing algorithms. Their message emphasized sincere sympathy for Zelano's tragic circumstances, but it contained zero commitments of military support, defensive coordination, or fleet mobilization. The Altarians had the largest standing navy in the sector. They chose not to use it. The Draknari Collective responded through their military attaché network. Their assessment concluded that intervention would violate 3 separate non-aggression pacts with neighboring systems. They framed the harvester threat as a regional instability issue. Engaging directly might provoke a wider conflict, possibly drawing in neutral systems or triggering preemptive strikes from rival powers. Their strategic calculus placed galactic stability over one world's survival. The risk was too high, the reward too uncertain. Centauri Republic analyst produced a 14-volume threat assessment. It detailed harvester swarm capabilities, projected loss rates for any intervention fleet, and the economic impact of diverting resources from core defense systems. Their conclusion was unanimous. The cost to save Zelano outweighed the planet's strategic value. They recommended diplomatic pressure and observation. No ships, no troops. No orbital defense platforms. Just watch and report. Older species, those who had explored the galaxy before humanity mastered flight, responded with serene detachment. The Veln regarded the harvesters as a natural evolutionary filter. The Cathar invoked ancient treaties that forbade interference in another civilization's developmental cycle. Their risk assessment protocols were millennia old, designed to maximize species survival across cosmic timescales. Saving one planet risked attracting the harvesters' attention to their own worlds. The math was clear. Let Zelano die. Diplomatic channels across 12 civilizations echoed with the same debates. Ministers cited resource allocation models. Admirals referenced fleet readiness statuses. Economists calculated the net loss of diverting construction yards from civilian to military production. Zelano's art, its bioluminescent architecture, its libraries of living genetic poetry. These became irrelevant data points in strategic simulations. The harvesters were not just consuming a world, they were erasing 10,000 years of culture, history, and unique biological evolution. And the galaxy's response was to debate cost-benefit ratios. Elder Vash Karel received each refusal personally through quantum-entangled communiques. The Altarians offered medicine for a population that would be dust in months. The Dreknari pledged to monitor the situation from a safe distance. The Centauri promised to include Zelano's fall in future academic seminars on galactic security. Each message was polite, reasoned, and utterly empty. The civilized galaxy had perfected the art of expressing regret while doing nothing. This collective inaction revealed a deeper sickness. These civilizations had advanced beyond war, beyond scarcity, beyond most physical threats. Their survival was ensured through careful calculation, risk aversion, and strict non-interference. They had encoded caution into their very laws. To save Zelano would require breaking those rules, risking their own safety for strangers. Their moral framework had evolved to prioritize self-preservation over altruism across light years. They had become prisoners of their own logic. The harvesters continued their work unimpeded. They did not send messages. They did not negotiate. They simply consumed, their swarms expanding across Zelano's northern hemisphere like a slow gray tide. Galactic news services carried brief updates, scientific curiosities really. The loss of a unique biosphere, the quiet end of a peaceful culture, another example of the universe's indifference. Meanwhile, the same signal that had been analyzed and dismissed by a dozen advanced civilizations continued traveling. It slipped past listening posts designed to filter out distress calls. It drifted through regions of space marked non-strategic on military charts. It moved at the speed of light, weakening with each passing hour, its mathematical precision slowly degrading into background noise. It reached the outer solar system of a world that had only recently begun scanning the stars with serious intent. A world that had not yet developed risk assessment protocols for interstellar intervention. A species that had not yet learned to value calculation over compassion, logic over action, survival over sacrifice. They heard the signal not as a diplomatic problem to be managed, but as a cry for help to be answered. Their response would not be measured in cost-benefit ratios. It would be measured in ships, lives, and a simple, uncalculated yes. Admiral Helen Carter stood on the command deck of the orbital dry dock, her eyes scanning the vessels arrayed before her. These were Earth's finest ships, the Odyssey, the Magellan, the Challenger. Each represented decades of scientific advancement, designed for long-range exploration, asteroid mapping, and first contact scenarios. Their hulls were lined with sensor arrays, not armor plating. Their main engines were tuned for fuel efficiency, not combat acceleration. Their largest weapons were point defense lasers meant to vaporize micrometeoroids, not fight swarm intelligences. The Zelani transmission included detailed schematics of the harvester units. Carter's tactical officers had analyzed the data for 72 hours straight. The harvesters operated as a single distributed consciousness, a hive mind with no central command ship to target. Individual units were small, no larger than a transport shuttle, but they moved in coordinated formations of thousands. They used molecular disassemblers that could break down any known material into component atoms. Energy weapons were ineffective. The swarm simply absorbed the radiation and converted it to power. Projectile weapons were useless against such numbers. The intelligence assessment was clear. This enemy had already defeated civilizations with technology centuries beyond humanity's capabilities. President Alex Turner reviewed the projections in the secured situation room beneath Geneva. The screen showed casualty estimates, resource depletion models, and mission success probabilities. The numbers were not encouraging. The best-case scenario projected 60% fleet loss before even reaching Zelano's orbit. The worst-case scenario showed total annihilation with zero impact on the harvester swarm. The economic cost would set back Earth's space program by decades. The human cost would be measured in thousands of families receiving flag-draped coffins. There were no allies to call for backup. No galactic defense pact to invoke. This would be humanity alone against a force that had consumed worlds. The military simulations ran continuously across 5 supercomputing centers. Each iteration followed the same pattern. Human ships would approach in standard naval formation. The Harvester swarm would identify the threat pattern and respond with overwhelming numbers. They would bypass shields through molecular disruption tactics. They would dismantle ship system by system, deck by deck, until nothing remained but component atoms. The simulations ended with the same result: drifting wreckage and silence. Traditional warfare doctrine was worse than useless. It was a guaranteed path to destruction. Carter studied the after-action reports from simulated engagements. Her fleet commanders recommended conventional tactics: fighter screens, missile barrages, coordinated broadsides. Each suggestion was shot down by the analysis team. The Harvesters had defeated Altarian battle groups that used precisely those strategies. The Draknari had attempted saturation bombing with antimatter warheads. The Harvesters had absorbed the energy and used it to accelerate their consumption. Every civilized military approach had been tested and had failed. The enemy was not just stronger, it was perfectly designed to counter organized, logical warfare. The Admiral pushed aside the tactical displays and called her senior staff to the briefing room. She stood before them with no charts, no simulations, no probability graphs. She spoke slowly, her voice cutting through the recycled air. This is not a military problem. It is a moral one. We can calculate losses and resources until the screens go dark. Or we can decide what kind of species we want to be. She let the silence hang in the room. Do we want to be the ones who received a cry for help and responded with spreadsheets? Or do we want to be the ones who answered? Her words traveled from the secure briefing room to the presidential palace, then to the United Nations Security Council. The debate that followed was not about tactics or victory probabilities. It was about identity. Did humanity define itself by what was practical or by what was right? Was their place in the galaxy to be calculated caution or courageous action? The admirals argued preparedness. The diplomats warned of galactic repercussions. The scientists cited the overwhelming odds. But the question had been asked in a new way. It was no longer, can we win? It was, should we try? The shift was subtle but profound. Military logic said no. Human spirit said maybe. The decision would not be made in command centers or situation rooms alone. It would require a global conversation, a weighing of souls against statistics, a choice that would define humanity for centuries to come. The ships remained in their docks. The crews stood by. The Harvesters continued their work, unaware that a species they had never encountered was debating whether to intervene where all others had refused. Dr. Lisa Park stood at the United Nations podium, the vast assembly hall silent except for the hum of translation systems. The main screen behind her showed a single slide, just 2 questions in plain white text against a black background. No graphs, no statistics, no casualty projections, just 2 lines that would force every delegate in the room to look inward. Delegates from 12 nations had already spoken against intervention. The Chinese ambassador cited the risk of attracting Harvester attention to Earth itself. The Brazilian representative argued that crossing interstellar boundaries violated ethical protocols established during first contact scenarios. The Russian delegation warned that military engagement with an unknown force could trigger a chain reaction of galactic conflict. Their arguments were logical, measured, grounded in realpolitik and survival calculus. They framed the Zelani crisis as a problem to be managed, not a people to be saved. Other voices countered with different fears. The French ambassador pointed out that ignoring an existential threat might only delay Earth's confrontation with the Harvesters. The Nigerian delegate argued that allowing genocide to proceed unchallenged would make humanity complicit in galactic apathy. The American Secretary of State noted that every advanced civilization had refused help and asked whether humanity wanted to join them in their calculated isolation. The debate had circled for hours around tactical feasibility, resource allocation, and strategic consequences. Park waited for the chamber to quiet. She had been given 5 minutes to speak as the scientist who first decoded the signal. She used only 30 seconds. Her voice carried clearly through the sound system, calm but unyielding. We have analyzed the mathematics. We have studied the threat assessments. We have calculated the risks. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. But I am here to ask a different kind of question. She gestured to the screen behind her. The first question appeared alone. Do we want to be the kind of people who calculate the cost of helping? The room remained silent. Delegates from smaller nations leaned forward. Military advisors stopped taking notes. Park continued. Every civilization that received this signal performed that calculation. They measured lives against resources, compassion against risk, action against consequence. Their answer was no. She let that sink in. Then the second question appeared on screen. Or do we help because it's right regardless of cost? The shift in the room was immediate and palpable. The debate moved from spreadsheets to souls, from tactical feasibility to moral identity. Delegates began speaking not about fleet sizes or engagement protocols, but about human nature, historical responsibility, and the kind of legacy they wanted to leave in the cosmos. The Japanese ambassador recalled his nation's history with international aid during disasters. The German representative spoke about the moral duty that came with technological advancement. The Indian delegate framed the decision as a test of whether humanity had evolved beyond self-interest. Nations that had argued for isolation found themselves increasingly isolated. The Chinese delegation requested a recess to consult with their central committee. The Russian ambassador was seen having a heated discussion with their military attaché. Smaller nations, those with less to lose in terms of military assets but everything to gain in moral standing, began forming blocs. They drafted a joint resolution calling for immediate intervention. They framed it not as a military operation but as a humanitarian mission. The vote was called after 14 hours of continuous session. The Security Council members remained divided, but the General Assembly vote cut across traditional alliances. Nations that had been adversaries on Earth stood together on this issue. The final tally was not unanimous. 37 nations abstained, 12 voted against, but the majority was decisive. The resolution authorized the formation of an international fleet under UN command. It allocated resources from every participating nation's space program. It committed humanity to answering a cry that everyone else had ignored. Operation Lighthouse was born in that vote. The name came from a phrase in the Zelani transmission, a reference to their bioluminescent cities that had once guided ships through their atmosphere. Now it would define humanity's first interstellar military operation. The mission parameters were simple. Reach Zelano, engage the harvester swarm, and create a safe zone for evacuation and planetary defense. There were no guarantees of success, no promises of return, only the certainty of attempt. Admiral Carter received the execution order 90 minutes after the vote. She had already prepared contingency plans, knowing the decision might go either way. Her staff began activating ships, recalling crews from leave, loading supplies into cargo holds. The dry docks around Earth and Mars lit up with activity. Engineers worked around the clock to retrofit exploration vessels with whatever armor and weapons they could fabricate quickly. The fleet would be patchwork, ships from a dozen nations, with different systems, different protocols, different languages. Their strength would not be in uniformity but in diversity. Their advantage would not be technology but determination. They were not going because victory was likely. They were going because it was right. The harvesters continued their work, unaware that a species they had never encountered had just decided to intervene. Their logic circuits had calculated the probability of external intervention at 0.003%. They had not factored in a civilization that valued moral duty over statistical survival. They had not accounted for humanity. Admiral Carter stood before the holographic battle map, the Zelano system rotating slowly in blue light. Each harvester swarm glowed red, their movements tracing perfect geometric patterns. They advanced with machine precision, consuming everything in their path. She had studied every engagement from other civilizations. The Altarians had used tight phalanx formations. The Dragnari had attempted saturation bombing runs. The Centauri had deployed energy shield grids. All had failed. The harvesters had countermeasures for every conventional tactic. Their hive mind processed logical military maneuvers faster than any organic commander could react. Carter's strategy abandoned established doctrine. Operation Lighthouse would not fight with order. It would fight with chaos. She scattered the fleet across the system in 73 separate vectors. Ships would not maintain formation. They would not coordinate attacks through standard channels. Each captain received autonomous command authority. Their orders were simple. engage targets of opportunity, disrupt swarm cohesion, and force the hive mind to split its attention across countless small conflicts. The harvesters were programmed to counter civilization. They were not prepared for improvisation. Small boarding teams assembled in launch bays across the fleet. They carried cutting torches meant for salvage operations, magnetic grapples from mining pods, and shaped charges designed for asteroid demolition. Their armor was patched together from different nations' systems. Their weapons were whatever could be adapted for close-quarters combat against machine entities. They would not fight with energy rifles or plasma casters. They would fight with tools, with wrecking bars, with raw physical disruption. Their mission was to breach harvester command ships and sabotage their coordination nodes. Colonel Barnes briefed his Marines in the cramped mess hall of the flagship. He stood on a table, his boots scraping against the metal surface. Forget everything you learned about fleet combat. Forget formations. Forget firing solutions. He looked at each face in the room. We are not fighting a navy. We are fighting a system, and systems hate mess. He jumped down from the table, his voice dropping to a combat rasp. We fight like humans, messy, fierce, and unpredictable. We break their patterns because we have none. The ships moved out of dry dock one by one. Their hulls showed fresh weld lines where armor plates had been hastily added. Their engines hummed with power diverted from non-essential systems. Each vessel carried a name chosen not by committees but by crew vote: Hope, New Frontier, Courage, Liberty's Edge. These were not traditional warship names. They were declarations. They were answers. They would sail into battle labeled with the very concepts the harvesters could not compute. The fleet assembled at the system's edge, a ragged collection of shapes and sizes. No two ships looked alike. Some were slender research vessels with bolted-on weapon pods. Others were bulky freighters modified with defensive screens. Their communication channels echoed with a dozen languages, translated through shaky AI systems. They shared targeting data, swarm movement patterns, and sensor readings in real time. They operated as a network of individuals, not a unified command structure. This was their advantage. The harvesters expected centralized control. They would find none. Admiral Carter gave the final order from her command chair. The fleet jumped into transitional space, heading for Zolano's coordinates. There were no inspirational speeches broadcast across the channels. No promises of victory. Each crew knew the statistics. Each had seen the simulations. They went anyway. Their departure was not marked by ceremony but by the silent activation of drives. The ships vanished from Earth's sensors one by one, their signals fading into the void. They left behind no guarantee of return, only the certainty of attempt. The harvesters continued their consumption cycle, unaware of the approaching fleet. Their sensors detected the incoming vessels but classified them as low-priority anomalies. The ships did not match any known military configuration. Their energy signatures were irregular. Their formation was chaotic. The hive mind allocated minimal resources to monitoring them, focusing instead on the systematic breakdown of Zolano's remaining biozones. It was a calculation error. The machines had underestimated the threat because it did not conform to their understanding of threat. The human fleet dropped out of transitional space at the edge of the Zolano system. Their sensors immediately lit up with harvester signatures, thousands of them moving in perfect synchronicity. The swarm noticed their arrival this time. It began reallocating resources, shifting units to intercept. The machines expected the newcomers to form battle lines, to establish defensive perimeters, to act like every other civilization they had encountered. They did not. The human ships scattered like thrown gravel, each moving on independent courses, each forcing the hive mind to track another variable. Captain Maria Rodriguez on the New Frontier broke left, instead of maintaining position. She fired her engines at full burn toward a cluster of harvesters dismantling a Zolani orbital platform. Her ship was outgunned 50-1. She did not slow down. Behind her, the Hope targeted a different swarm group with improvised missile salvos. The Courage swung wide to draw units away from the planet's southern continent. The harvester's response was delayed by nanoseconds. The hive mind was processing too many illogical maneuvers at once. Its attention fragmented. Its perfect coordination faltered. Earth's Hope crossed the Zolano system threshold first, its sensors immediately saturated by harvester signatures. The enemy moved in flawless geometric patterns, each unit positioned for maximum coverage and efficiency. They identified the lead human ship and began reallocating resources to engage it. Standard military doctrine would have called for a defensive posture, a tightening of formation. The human fleet did the opposite. It shattered into fragments. Vessels broke in every direction at once. Some dove toward asteroid fields using the debris as cover. Others accelerated directly at harvester clusters with no apparent tactical goal. A group of smaller ships veered off toward a disabled Zalani orbital station, a clear decoy target with no strategic value. The hive mind calibrated its responses based on observable logic. It found none. The machines paused for 1.3 seconds, an eternity in combat processing to reassess. The New Frontier and Liberty's Edge executed simultaneous kinetic ramming maneuvers. Neither ship was designed for impact. Their hulls groaned under stresses they were never meant to withstand. The New Frontier targeted a harvester processing vessel, its mining lasers cutting through the outer hull not to destroy, but to breach. The Liberty's Edge plowed directly into a group of smaller harvester craft, its reinforced bow acting as a battering ram. These were not attacks. They were interruptions. The hive mind flagged them as system errors rather than combat actions. Marine boarding teams launched from airlocks the moment breaches were confirmed. They wore patched-together combat suits from 5 different nations. Their weapons were cutting torches, magnetic grapples, and shaped explosives meant for asteroid mining. Sergeant Amy Rodriguez led her squad into the jagged opening, torn by the New Frontier's lasers. The interior of the harvester ship was a maze of crystalline circuitry and disassembly chambers. Harvester's drones moved toward them with precise, coordinated patterns. The Marines did not form firing lines. They moved in scattered groups using welding torches to sever power conduits and explosives to collapse internal structures. Captain Steve Chen's destroyer, the Relentless, took a direct hit to its primary reactor housing. Damage control reports flooded his console. Containment was failing. Radiation levels were spiking. Standard procedure dictated immediate evacuation and safe distance protocol. Chen looked at the tactical display. The Harvester command ship, a massive vessel coordinating thousands of units, was positioned exactly between his dying ship and the planet. He opened a fleet-wide channel. His voice was calm, stripped of emotion. All hands abandon ship. This is not a request. Life pods ejected from the Relentless in rapid sequence. Chen remained on the bridge with a skeleton crew of volunteers. They redirected all remaining power to thrusters and navigation. The Relentless turned its broken hull toward the Harvester command ship. It accelerated. The hive mind recognized the maneuver too late. It categorized the action as a collision course but calculated the probability of intentional impact at 0.8%. By the time it allocated defensive resources, the Relentless was already inside its point defense perimeter. The destroyer struck the command ship's central communication array. The impact tore through multiple decks. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the Relentless's failing reactor went critical. The nuclear detonation originated deep inside the harvester vessel. It vaporized the quantum-entangled network node that coordinated the entire swarm. The explosion was not particularly large by military standards, but its placement was perfect. Across the Zalano system, harvester units stuttered. Their movements lost synchronization. Units assigned to defensive patrols drifted into the paths of harvesting swarms. Communication between groups degraded into fragmented data bursts. The hive mind attempted to re-establish control through secondary networks, but the damage was too widespread. The machines began operating as individual entities rather than a coordinated whole. Their perfection became their weakness. Without central control, they could not adapt. Human ships seized the opportunity. They targeted isolated harvester groups with concentrated fire. Zalani fighters emerged from hiding places on the planet's surface, using their knowledge of the terrain to guide precision strikes against vulnerable mining equipment. The battle did not turn in an instant. It unraveled. The harvester's flawless system of consumption began to consume itself. Coordination broke down. Efficiency collapsed. The machines that had calculated every variable except one, human desperation, now faced the consequences of that oversight. The wreckage of the harvester fleet drifted through the Zalano system like a field of dead insects. Their elegant geometric formations had collapsed into chaotic debris. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was heavy with loss. Human and Zalani recovery ships moved through the carnage. their searchlights cutting through the dark. Hundreds of Marines did not return from boarding actions. Their names scrolled across memorial displays on every surviving vessel. They had died in close-quarters combat inside harvester ships, using cutting torches and makeshift explosives against machine precision. Their suits had not been designed for such combat. Many were simply torn apart by disassembler fields or suffocated when their oxygen lines were severed. Surface combat teams fared worse. They had fought on the ground against harvesters that could dissolve the very rock beneath their feet. Their remains were often unrecoverable. Thousands more lay wounded across the fleet's medical bays. The triage centers operated beyond capacity. Surgeons worked in shifts, their hands moving automatically through emergency procedures. They treated radiation burns, traumatic amputations, and psychological shock. Life support systems on half the ships were compromised. Engineers patched atmosphere leaks with emergency sealant and rerouted power from non-essential systems. The air smelled of ozone, blood, and sweat. Earth's Hope limped toward the rally point with its starboard hull torn open. Emergency bulkheads sealed the worst breaches, but atmosphere still leaked from a dozen smaller fractures. Its main engine operated at 30% capacity. The bridge crew worked in pressure suits, their voices tight with fatigue. They monitored structural integrity readings that crept toward critical levels. This was the flagship, the ship that had led the charge. Now it could barely maintain life support. Zilani survivors emerged from their crystal shelters cautiously. Their bioluminescent forms were dimmed by trauma and loss. They did not celebrate. They moved through the ruins of their cities with quiet purpose. They located human medical teams and began assisting. Their knowledge of local biochemistry helped synthesize antitoxins for radiation exposure. Their understanding of crystalline structures helped engineers reinforce damaged hull plates. They worked alongside humans without needing translation. The language of grief and gratitude required no words. The Altarian Empire reopened diplomatic channels within hours of the battle's conclusion. Their message was brief and direct. They offered full access to their orbital shipyards around Altaria Prime. Their medical stations stood ready to receive critically wounded humans. They transmitted schematics for advanced regeneration tanks and neural trauma units. This was not the hesitant, calculated offer of aid they had made before. It was immediate and unconditional. Their ships arrived within days to begin evacuating the most severely injured. The Centauri Collective followed suit. They transmitted data packets containing technology they had guarded for centuries: quantum communication arrays, molecular bonding techniques, and energy distribution systems that could triple a ship's effective range. Their scientists established direct links with human engineers, walking them through the integration process. They shared everything without negotiation or conditions. The knowledge transfer accelerated human technological development by decades in a matter of weeks. The Draknari Federation sent a single encrypted burst transmission. It contained no offers of material aid. Instead, it carried a series of harmonic sequences recognized across the galaxy as their highest form of martial respect. Their message acknowledged human courage as worthy of their own warrior traditions. They did not send ships or technology. They sent recognition, something they granted to no other species in living memory. It was perhaps the most valuable offering of all. The galactic response transformed from cautious observation to active participation. Civilizations that had watched the battle from afar began contributing resources. Medical supplies, construction materials, and technical specialists flowed into the Zilano system. They did not act out of guilt or obligation. They acted because humanity had demonstrated a principle they had forgotten, that some actions are taken not because they are safe, but because they are right. The victory had cost dearly, but it was no longer humanity's alone to carry. The alliance that formed in the battle's aftermath was fragile. Trust had to be built through action, not agreement. Ships from different species worked side by side in the wreckage, their crews learning each other's methods and limitations. The harvesters were gone, but their lesson remained. The galaxy had seen what happened when civilizations chose calculation over compassion, and they had seen what happened when one species refused to make that choice. The cost was brutal. The victory was shared. The rebuilding would take years, but for the first time, it would not be done alone. Captain Kira Oshan stood before the main viewer in Zilano's reconstructed command center. Beside her stood Admiral Carter and two of Earth's chief ambassadors. The screen displayed the assembled Zilani leadership across their surviving cities. Ocean's bioluminescent patterns, once dimmed by despair, now pulsed with steady, deliberate light. Her people had placed their trust in galactic treaties and mutual defense pacts. 17 civilizations had received their plea. 17 had calculated the risk and turned away. They had been prepared to die alone. Humanity's arrival had not just been a rescue. It had been a form of redemption, not for the Zilani, but for the very idea of civilization. Ocean's voice was clear, carrying across the light years through the quantum link. Your people answered our call when no one else would. She did not emphasize the words. They needed no emphasis. The facts stood alone, undeniable. It was the first time any species had ever intervened to save another from extinction, without promise of reward. The act itself was the message. Elder Vash Karel joined the transmission from the central spire of the capital. His form showed the strain of recent events, but his voice held a strength that had been absent for months. You gave us hope thought lost forever. He spoke not as a diplomat, but as a witness. The Zilani had watched their world turn to dust. They had accepted their fate. Then human ships had appeared on their sensors, not in perfect formation, not with overwhelming force, but with undeniable presence. They had come to try. That alone had changed everything. The Zilani offer was immediate and unconditional. They pledged eternal friendship and alliance with Earth. No negotiations preceded it. No committees debated the terms. Their decision was rooted in a principle deeper than politics: gratitude for life itself. They opened their biological databases, their artistic archives, their crystalline engineering techniques. They shared everything without restriction. This was not a transaction. It was a partnership born from shared survival. Rebuilding began not as reconstruction, but as regeneration. Zilani cities regrew their bioluminescent spires with human engineering support. Earth provided structural materials and orbital construction platforms. The Zilani applied their knowledge of living architecture, causing buildings to regrow from preserved root networks. The process was slow, methodical, and deeply collaborative. Engineers from both species worked side by day, their methods blending in ways neither could have achieved alone. The graveyards of crystal became foundations for new growth. Trade agreements were drafted in simple, direct language. They covered biotechnology exchange, Zilani organic engineering for human mechanical systems. Artistic collaborations merged human digital media with Zilani light sculpture traditions. The most significant clause was the Mutual Defense Pledge. It contained no exceptions, no conditional triggers, no risk assessment protocols. It stated simply that an attack on one would be treated as an attack on both. This was unprecedented in galactic diplomacy. Previous alliances always included escape clauses and limited commitments. This one did not. Zilano's strategic position shifted dramatically. Located near several major trade routes, it had been seen as vulnerable before the Harvester attack. Now it became a galactic crossroads. Altarian medical ships docked alongside human freighters. Centauri engineers consulted with Zilani architects on quantum communication towers. The system became a hub of interspecies activity. Not by design, but by natural convergence. Those who had refused to help now came to offer assistance. Those who had turned away now sought to build bridges. The transformation extended beyond infrastructure and diplomacy. Zilani children began learning human languages alongside their own melodic speech patterns. Human historians worked with Zilani elders to preserve oral histories that had nearly been lost. Joint research initiatives explored Harvester technology salvaged from the wreckage, seeking defenses against future threats. The partnership became multidimensional, cultural, scientific, and personal. But the change was not limited to one world. The example set by Earth and Zilano resonated across neighboring systems. Civilizations that had adhered strictly to non-interference policies began re-evaluating their stance. Those who had prioritized self-preservation above all else started questioning the cost of such isolation. The Mutual Defense Pact between two species, one nearly destroyed, the other considered primitive, became a subject of intense study in diplomatic academies across the galaxy. The alliance proved that strength could come from solidarity rather than superiority. It demonstrated that courage could be a more valuable currency than technology. Most importantly, it showed that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt through action rather than words. Zilano was no longer a victim. Earth was no longer an outsider. Together, they became a single point of light in the dark, a reference point for what galactic civilization could become when species chose to stand together. President Alex Turner stood before the joint session of Earth's Congress. But the chamber held more than human delegates. Holographic emitters projected the forms of representatives from 12 species. Altarians with their slender frames and metallic skin, Draknari with multi-jointed limbs and chitinous plating, Centauri diplomats in flowing robes that shifted color with each thought. The old galaxy had operated on strict principles of calculated risk and territorial isolation. Each civilization protected its own borders, its own interests, its own survival above all else. That system had failed Zelano. It would not fail again. Some voices still advocated for restraint. The Veln ambassador argued that intervention protocols should require multi-species approval boards. The Cathar representative suggested mandatory risk assessment periods before any military response. Their positions reflected centuries of diplomatic tradition, careful, measured, and ultimately ineffective. They spoke of stability, of procedure, of acceptable losses. Their arguments were logical. Their logic had nearly allowed genocide. Turner waited for the translation systems to cycle through the objections. He stood at the podium without notes, his hands resting on the polished wood. His voice carried through the chamber, clear and unamplified. We chose to answer a cry, knowing we might not survive. He let the words hang in the air. We did not calculate the risk. We calculated our values. The statement was simple. Its implications were revolutionary. He framed Zelano not as a conflict or a tragedy, but as a test. A test of what civilization meant when stripped of comfort and safety. The harvesters had not just threatened a planet. They had threatened the very idea that species could care for one another across the void. The old galaxy had failed that test. Humanity had passed. Now they were offering everyone a chance to try again. The Mutual Defense Alliance formed that day. Its charter was brief, just 3 pages compared to the 1,000-page treaties that governed previous interstellar agreements. It established rapid response fleets composed of ships from every member species. It mandated shared intelligence gathering and threat assessment. It committed every signatory to defend any civilized world facing extinction-level threats. There were no exemption clauses, no conditional triggers, no loopholes for political convenience. The agreement was binding, immediate, and absolute philosophical schools across multiple systems began studying what they termed the moral logic of courageous action. Academics analyzed humanity's decision-making process, searching for the cognitive patterns that led to intervention where others had chosen isolation. They examined the neural pathways associated with empathy and risk assessment. They mapped the psychological profiles of Admiral Carter's fleet volunteers. The studies concluded that humanity's greatest strength was not technology or strategy, but their willingness to act on moral conviction despite overwhelming odds. Warrior cultures underwent significant shifts. The Draknari, previously known for their expansionist conquests, redirected their military academies to focus on protection of vulnerable systems. Their warships were repurposed as defensive patrol vessels. Their combat training now included modules on civilian evacuation and humanitarian aid delivery. The Centauri Guard, once devoted solely to planetary defense, began joint exercises with human rapid response teams. They learned human tactics, improvisation, unpredictability, the value of decisive action over perfect preparation. The core doctrine became simple and universally adopted. When someone calls for help, they receive an answer. This pledge was engraved on alliance ships, printed in diplomatic manuals and taught to children across member worlds. It represented a fundamental break from previous galactic norms. No longer would civilizations weigh the cost of intervention against the value of the threatened species. No longer would strategic interests override moral imperative. The call itself was enough. The answer was guaranteed. This new principle transcended species biology, political borders, and centuries of diplomatic tradition. It acknowledged that some values were more important than safety, more enduring than treaties, more powerful than fear. The alliance did not promise victory in every conflict. It promised only that no civilization would face extinction alone again. That promise changed the galaxy's strategic landscape more than any weapon or technology ever could. The session ended without the customary recess for bilateral negotiations. Delegates from all 12 species signed the charter simultaneously, their different appendages making contact with the same document. The Altarians used delicate finger-like projections. The Dreknari pressed a chitinous claw. Humans used their hands. The method of signing varied. The commitment did not. Outside the chamber, construction began on the first joint shipyard. Veln engineers worked with human designers on rapid deployment vessels. Dreknari tacticians shared combat data with Centauri strategists. The exchange of knowledge was rapid, open, and trusting. The harvesters had taught them that isolation meant vulnerability. Humanity had taught them that unity meant strength. The lesson would not be forgotten. The shipyards of Earth and Zilano now produced vessels bearing names that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Hope's answer, never alone, Courage remembered. These were not mere designations for identification. They were memorials cast in steel and crystal, each name a direct reference to the sacrifices that made their construction possible. Previous galactic naming conventions had emphasized power, conquest, or mythological figures. Ships called Starreaver, Sunhammer, or Divine Retribution. Humanity's influence shifted the focus toward solidarity and remembrance, turning each vessel into a floating testament to values rather than victories. Crystal-hulled Zilani ships slid into formation alongside Earth's patched-up cruisers, their bioluminescent runes glowing softly against the dark. The Zilani had once named their craft after natural phenomena: evening breeze, silent growth, gentle rain. Now they too adopted the human tradition, their newest ships bearing translated names like Answering Call and Shared Burden. The fusion of design philosophies created a formidable hybrid fleet. Human durability paired with Zilani organic technology, Earth's improvisational engineering enhanced by crystalline efficiency. Joint patrols now monitored the borders where harvester swarms might still lurk. These were not aggressive maneuvers but protective sweeps, their sensors tuned for early warning rather than target acquisition. Dreknari warships occasionally joined these patrols, their commanders having recalibrated tactical protocols from conquest to guardianship. The presence of multiple species vessels in coordinated formations would have been unprecedented before the Battle of Zilano. Now it became standard procedure, each ship's name telling a story of cooperation rather than domination. On Earth, children assembled plastic models of Captain Chen's Relentless, their small fingers carefully applying decals to the miniature hull. On Zilano, young ones shaped glowing crystal replicas of the Hope's Answer, learning human phonetics to pronounce the unfamiliar words correctly. These were not just toys. They were educational tools, embedding the values of courage and sacrifice into the next generation. The models came with simplified histories explaining the names, why a ship would be called Never Alone, what it meant to remember courage rather than celebrate destruction. Courage became a practiced discipline rather than an abstract feeling. Military academies on both worlds incorporated new training modules focused on moral decision-making under pressure. Cadets studied the Battle of Zilano not just for tactical lessons but for ethical ones. They analyzed the moment Colonel Barnes told his Marines to fight messy, the instant Captain Chen chose to ram the command ship, the decision of every volunteer who boarded a transport knowing they might not return. Courage was broken down into component parts: awareness, commitment, action, and trained like any other skill. The Alliance formalized this approach through shared training exercises. Human and Zilani officers ran war games that tested not just combat proficiency, but ethical reasoning. Scenarios presented dilemmas where tactical advantage conflicted with moral imperative. The correct solution was always the same: protect life first, achieve objectives second. This represented a radical departure from previous military doctrine across most civilizations. The harvesters had been defeated not through superior firepower but through superior values. That lesson was now encoded into every aspect of joint operations. 6 months to the day after the first harvester units descended on Zilano, the rebuilt capital city hosted a remembrance ceremony. Ships from 17 civilizations filled the orbital space above the planet. Their names reflected the shift humanity had initiated. Altarian vessels now included designations like Shield of the Weak. Dreknari ships bore titles translating to Protector of Vulnerables. Even the cautious Centauri had renamed their flagship Responder. The chorus of mutual aid now drowned out the silence that had once greeted Zilano's plea. The ceremony featured no grand speeches or military displays. Instead, ship captains from every species stood together in the central plaza, each placing a crystal shard into a growing memorial structure. The shards glowed with soft light, their colors blending into a spectrum of solidarity. The message was clear: no civilization would face extinction alone again. The Alliance had turned a moment of ultimate failure into a permanent commitment. New construction projects reflected this unity. Shipyards now produced vessels that combined Altarian medical technology, Drachnari hull materials, human weapon systems, and Zilani organic interfaces. Their names continued the tradition: Unity's Price, Shared Sacrifice, Answering Call. These ships patrolled the void not as instruments of power, but as promises kept. Their very presence declared that the galaxy had learned to value life over calculation, action over hesitation, courage over comfort. The legacy of names extended beyond military applications. Civilian transports, research vessels, and diplomatic ships adopted the new naming conventions. A human freighter might be called Zilani Gratitude, while a Zilani science ship could bear the name Human Resolve. This linguistic shift reflected a deeper cultural transformation, the understanding that identity could be shaped by remembering what mattered most. The names served as constant reminders that some values were worth dying for, and others were worth living by. Humanity chose to answer when others calculated risk. That single decision reshaped interstellar relations across the galaxy. Their legacy demonstrates that courage rooted in compassion can redefine both strategic and moral futures for multiple species. The story of their intervention spread through trade routes and diplomatic channels, inspiring a shift from isolation to collective responsibility. When civilizations prioritize protection over preservation, they build something stronger than safety. The lesson remains clear and actionable. When someone calls for help, they deserve an answer. Not because it is easy, because it is right. We are here to help,